When I think of what we usually encounter for Maundy Thursday worship, it's a sensual, experiential remembrance. While most worship services throughout the year have lots of sounds and some sights, Maundy Thursday also includes smell and taste and touch. We get up out of our seats and move around the worship space as we wash hands or feet, eat the juice-soaked bread of Holy Communion, and kneel at the altar to pray. Our hearts drop into our stomachs when we go with Jesus from the table out into the garden, where he will be taken by soldiers to his eventual death. The feeling, the embodiment of this day is appropriate because we are celebrating and remembering our enfleshed, incarnate deity, one who ate with friends and knelt to wash their dusty, sweaty feet.
Jesus taught us to use our bodies to experience the world, to experience God, and also to love and serve one another. Hear these words from John 13. I give you a new commandment, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also should love one another. Jesus' incarnation made our bodies sacred, showing us that there is more to faith and doctrine and beliefs. Faith is about putting love into action.
For 3 years, the disciples journeyed with Jesus. They followed him, learning at his feet, healing in his name. They were with him when he was teaching and when he withdrew from the crowds, when he performed sign after sign, walking on water, feeding the thousands, raising his friend from the dead. They laughed with him and they cried with him. They followed him, perhaps for a kingdom that was never to be. He was supposed to be their Messiah, their Savior, the one who would deliver them in the here and now, the one to save them from Roman rule and begin his literal reign of an earthly kingdom, to build a movement that would resist, revolt, overthrow. And so they gathered, like they usually did, for a meal, together. And here's what John says happened next.
Jesus got up from the table, took off his outer robe, and tied a towel around himself. Then he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel that was tied around him.
What does it mean to embody the servanthood of Jesus? To take on the nature of the Christ who humbled himself to be with us, who washed his disciples' feet, to make ourselves vulnerable, as he did.
Today we live in a culture where this type of vulnerability and intimacy is not always valued and is often discouraged. We are conditioned to navigate our societies with power and status, towering over one another, stepping over one another as we push towards the things we think will give us happiness, the things that might fill us with joy.
But we're called to something different. To take on the nature of Jesus, the character of Jesus.
to embody his servanthood today, now, in all the places where we might find ourselves. In those spaces where people temporarily live through extended periods of time or during the cold winter season. In the meals and cookies, supplies and clothes brought to our neighbors at Tent City and Camp Unity Eastside, and the other places that our siblings call home. We're called to humble ourselves, make ourselves vulnerable, and serve, focusing not on what we can get for ourselves, but on what we can do for others.
Jesus washed his disciples' feet as a way of showing us what servanthood looks like. But one of the things we often overlook when we think about service is that it requires community. Serving isn't something we can do on our own. Sometimes we may mistakenly think that our faith is just about us, our own individual relationships with Jesus, or how we're doing in our own spiritual lives.
Community can't be done on our own. And for reasons we may not always understand, God intentionally put us into imperfect communities full of imperfect people. Yet it's these imperfect people, the ones that sometimes bother us, sometimes even betray us, that help us grow into the people God calls us to be. It's community that teaches us to love, to serve, to relate. Community lifts us up when we are weak and brings us back to earth when we are proud. Community calls out our foolishness, brings us new perspectives about God, ourselves, and the world, and pushes us to be our best selves. We cannot be the people of God without community. When the global pandemic began, many of us wrestled with the challenges of being community together while being physically apart.
We knew that God's love had no bounds, that God's Spirit would and does connect us though we are apart. But being distanced, without handshakes and hugs, without the intimacy of looking at each other in the eyes and reading each other's emotions, we felt disconnected.
And what do we do with the bread and the cup? As we remember Jesus gathering at the table with his friends, we recognize the importance of gathering together at our tables virtually. God's love and grace knows no bounds. God's love and grace is abundant enough for all of us, uniting our hearts and our spirits together. So we take and eat. We drink from the cup. And we remember that we're in this together, and that community is more than those gathered in one place. It's the intentionality of being together, journeying together, committing to doing life together.
It's more difficult to experience those sensory attributes of Maundy Thursday in a pandemic year, when we are not washing one another's hands or feet, not taking communion together, not physically moving from sanctuary to garden at the end of the night.
But we can still use our bodies to put love into action. Writing cards and letters to show others they're not alone, even if they're quarantined by themselves. Wearing masks when we go out in public, even if we're not afraid of getting the virus ourselves. Preparing meals for loved ones, tending the earth around us.
I look forward to a Holy Week in which we'll experience Maundy Thursday worship all together again, with all of our senses. But until then, I'll be looking for other ways to celebrate the incarnation of Jesus by putting love into action with my hands and feet, unwashed as they may be.